Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. We've had a few episodes that have veered away from poetry, and there may be some more coming, but this one is all poetry. This episode I am speaking with Derek Mong about The Anthologist by Nichols and Baker. It's a book that's come up a few times previously on the podcast, but it's a real delight, even if it is often very wrong. It's a book about a guy making a poetry anthology, but mostly it's just a book talking about poetry and the poetry world. Derek reminded me of it. We talk about the book. We talk about the audio recording of the book, which is really, really good. We talk some about Derek's poetry, mine. We talk mostly about meter. This is like a big prosody episode. Nichols and Baker has some interesting and mostly very wrong ideas about meter, but we, I think, have a really fruitful conversation about different ways of looking at meter and the English poetic line. Derek is the author of When the Earth Flies into the Sun, among other books, and he, along with his wife, Annie O. Fisher, edits At Length, the magazine founded by Jonathan Farmer. Our dear friend here. At Length publishes literature that looks good on a laptop is their slogan, but that's a good slogan, but it's not very clear. Like, the point isn't the point they publish long stuff. They publish long stuff. They publish long poems, long stories, long translations, long everything else. Derek and Annie have done a great job taking over. The website does look good on a laptop. They did it. It's a good website. Derek's pretty good with design in general. His book looks great. We talk a little bit about that. He also, I can't remember which part. It's a 2-part episode. It was just a really long, fun, rambling conversation about the book, but also just about the poetry world it depicts, as well as the one we live in, which is slightly different because the book came out almost 20 years ago. I can't remember whether it's in the first half or the second half, but Derek has a copy of my book that has the weirdest fucking misprint I've ever heard of. It is bizarre. So we do talk about that and a number of other things. Again, this is a real poetry heavy episode. You will get your full recommended daily serving of poetic fiber from this episode. And then some other real sloppy, weird ones are coming up. But I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. This is Derek Mong, author of When the Earth Flies into the Sun. What is his line about podcasters? He expresses initial admiration for those podcasters who keep recording week after week, even though no one is listening.
Yeah. He's got a couple of really lovely descriptions of what his own podcast could be, because his name is Paul Chowder. Chowder's Bowl of Poetry, Chowder's Plum Fest of Poems. Hello and welcome to the Paul Chowder Poetry Hour. I'm your host and confidant, Paul Chowder, and I'd like to welcome you to Chowder's Flying Spoonful of Rhyme.
Yeah,
I thought that page might be particularly appealing to somebody who actually does host a poetry podcast.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it is, I definitely I don't think I have any of Baker's or Chowder's easygoing charm. There was a good, I think the term that I saw in one of the reviews was lovable chump. That he is like very hangdog, but really winning.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this book, my wife and I listened to it on the drive to our honeymoon, and I want to say we may even have listened to it again at some other point because it's such a beguiling, charming performance. And like, I have only at this point encountered it because I listened to it again for this conversation. I've only encountered it in the ears, but it's such a good recording that I highly recommend that version of it.
I would agree 100%. And it sounds like you listened to the one that Nichols and Baker recorded himself. Perhaps that's the only one. I would imagine there's not like
I don't
audio
know
recordings of this.
Right, yeah. No, definitely the one he did, and he sings, and it's his imagining of it pretty thoroughly.
Yeah, and having just, discussed this with my wife, who's got a new translation out that she did not do the recording for. They hired, a professional. This isn't exactly always the best thing to do, is to let the author go and do the recording of their own novel. But I think Baker does a relatively good job of it. And I found it kind of curious that both you and I listened to it. I wonder if there was something about it because it's not a particularly imposing book when you see it on the shelf. It's, a little over 200 pages. It's the kind of
Yeah.
thing, and they're not like, pages and pages of text. It's not like, the Bible paper that we print Moby Dick on. There's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
anyway.
No, it's a yeah.
So yeah, so I like found it on a long drive to Ohio, and I was like, oh, I can knock this back in there and then halfway up the drive back. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's interesting because you approached it in the very same way. It's like, oh yeah, this is an audiobook.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean we were kind of spoiled by it because we listened to that and then the only really satisfying audiobooks we've found since then were Laura Lippman books, which we only really, I think, like, for us, it's really, 90% of it is the charm of Baltimore nostalgia. And
Right,
we
right.
actually did also at some point listen to, I realized, the sequel to this, which, as you mentioned, it is about songwriting and politics. And my recollection is that it was perfectly charming and enjoyable, but it didn't it didn't win me over or kind of live on in my memory as much as this one did.
I haven't read it.
Yeah.
I know that it's currently released. So this is interesting. So I was trying to find a paper copy of this book for recording purposes because I couldn't like audio listen to it while we talked.
Right.
I couldn't actually buy one. I mean, I like to not go to Amazon. I can find one on
Sure.
Amazon,
Yeah.
but it's out of print.
The anthologist
And
is?
the anthologist is out of
Huh.
print.
That's
This
crazy.
may be because the publisher packaged this with the second one, which is like the traveling
Traveling
sprinkler.
sprinkler. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So you can buy both of them. And I have not seen this happen very often with novels. Like comic books will do this. They
Right.
print the anthologist on one side of the book, the traveling sprinkler on the other, and you have to like flip the book back and forth. So
Oh,
if you read halfway through, the text flips upside down and it's like that's your indication to go to the other side of the book and
what a
start.
weird way to like I've seen like manga do that where it's like
Right.
because like Japanese is printed the other way, of course, but yeah, that's a strange choice.
It was very odd, and it immediately felt weird in my hands and kind
Yeah.
of foreign and inappropriate. And I put it back on the shelf. I was like, I don't want this copy. Like, I'm kind of slightly interested in the sequel because the voice is so
Yeah.
winning, and we should tell listeners, right? It's a first person novel in the voice of this kind of failing poet named Paul Chowder, and it is his voice that carries the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my recommendation would be another time you have a long drive would be the way
Right.
to take it in. Because it it is. I mean, in that one, the anthologist I think has both. It is. I mean, he's famously not big on plots, and it does not really have a plot. Though it has a little more. They like listen to it again. They're like, well, there's it's a little more forward action than I had remembered. Though it's very very little. But it is. I think like part of the magic of it is that there is a tension between the voice and the argument because there is an argument being made, and I think the argument is where he gets into a little bit of trouble as well. Though
You're talking
I
about like
think
his argument
yeah.
about poetics.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Because like listening to it again, one of the thoughts I had was because it is. I mean, we're leaping totally into the middle of things, but he is putting off putting together an anthology, and the anthology is called Only Rhyme. It is a book of rhyming poetry. He loves rhyme, although most of his argument is really about meter. I mean, not
Yeah,
related, but it is sort of like only
yeah,
meter isn't as charming a title and wouldn't be as catchy on the bookshelves, but it is slightly off the subject of what he's actually interested in.
right.
But
Yeah,
he himself is, and his argument is like he has a very specific, as you pointed out, like slightly harebrained, but like in a certain way, highly conservative, crotchety argument about the history of meter and what poetry is and isn't and what it's like today. And listening to it again, the thought I had was like, well, the opinions that are expressed in this book, apart from like just the sort of the weirdness of some of the his argument about the 4-beat line, which we'll get into,
yeah, yeah,
they're very crotchety conservative, like neo-formalist, stick in the mud opinions. But I think his brilliance as a storyteller is that he intuitively knew that a book narrated by that guy would be intolerable. And so instead, he
Yeah.
narrates it as a mushy, friendly, wishy-washy, mainstream free verse poet. And so it's a little bit of the charm is that it's the tension between this guy's persona and his own actual work, because he writes these kind of cute free verse poems, and then his opinions, which are the opinions of somebody with a uh,
Right.
very different role in the poetry world.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting, and we should get into that. Like, so one of the things to note is that we never see any of his poems
Right.
in the book.
So we hear
He does just
Strong Motion is the title of the most successful one, and then he has the series called the Flying Spoon Poems. That's all we really hear of
yes,
them.
yes, and I think he has another book called Worn,
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah.
WORN. That, and again, you see none of these poems. He goes and gives a poetry reading, but we don't get to listen in and hear him give a poetry reading. He does very little actual poetry writing in the novel because he's so stuck.
Yeah.
His main job is to write this anthology introduction, which he's procrastinating as much as he can. It's very much a procrastination novel.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Flying Spoon poems he hasn't published, and we don't see any of those. And he describes himself as really not being that great at rhyme anymore, and not writing very, very many metrical poems, and instead writing what he describes as plums, which is
Yeah.
his way. And that sort of connects with the cover. If you see, you Google this book, the cover will pop up, and there's a very lovely, almost kind of like 19th century botanical illustration of a plum on it.
Mm.
I think the back cover has like the plum cut in half, and the plum is his metaphor for, I guess, the kind of plump, visually maybe shapely free verse poems that he seemingly is working on now.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's his
but you're right. Yeah.
sort of like dismissive characterization. He says basically that most poems as we encounter them today are not poems. They don't really count. That they are plums instead. Uh,
Yeah, he has almost a Louis Turco level of um, narrowness in terms of his definition of what constitutes a poem. Like, I was stunned at some point. I was probably reading Turco's Book of Forms, and I corresponded with him once ages ago to read that he essentially doesn't think a free verse poem is a poem. And Paul
oh yeah,
Chowder, our narrator, isn't quite that far in the kind of conservative formalist spectrum, but he's very dismissive of certain things that free verse poets take for granted. Like enjambment and, well, anyway, we can get in all that. Yeah.
no, this is what was sort of leapt out at me listening to it again. Elijah Blumoff, who does the Versecraft podcast, and he's on here
Yeah.
all the time. His term that he insists on using very stubbornly is he says that free verse poems are actually prose lyrics. So he will refer to he'll say like I'm going to I'll read a prose lyric by Carl Dennis, and I think like that there is a perfect illustration of like Elijah could write many wonderful types of literature. I wouldn't necessarily want to hear a novel in Elijah's voice that was half about free verse poetry and half about metrical poetry. I'd love to read his essays and plenty of other things,
Right.
but like it's exactly that playfulness that instead of sort of in a fussy way saying like, well, technically speaking, these are prose
Yes.
lyrics, he just comes up with this sort of odd but fitting metaphor, and it's not again, it's like if it were purely sneering, it would put us off. But
It'd be
instead,
off-putting.
he wins
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
He wins us over partly by saying like, and I myself write plums. That's what I write, and plums can be quite lovely.
Yeah. And he has some lovely things to say about, some of the most famous free verse poets like W.S. Merwin.
Yeah, yeah.
And he has a pleasant thing to say about James Wright's Autumn Begins and Martin. Oh, not, what am I thinking of?
Martin's
It's
Fury.
the William Duffy Farm poem. The
Oh
William
yeah,
Duffy
lying in a
Farm
hammock in William
poem is the
Duffy's
one that he
farm
named.
in Pine
Thank
Island,
you.
Minnesota. Yeah, yeah.
Very good. Yeah. Yeah. That's the one that he name checks, and a few others that he likes. But I feel like we should also give listeners a sense of this book. Have we done enough?
Yeah.
Or do we
No,
need
no, no.
to
Yeah,
sketch out
give a little
the rest
introductory
of it?
spiel so people kind of know what they're getting into. Though I
Okay.
should say our
And
digressive,
please,
winding, approach is also mimetic of the book itself.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So as you noted earlier, the book has very, very little plot. The first person narrative, the narrator, Paul Chowder, kind of middle-aged poet living in New England, who is tasked with writing this introduction that he consistently puts off for an anthology called Only Rhyme. He has a girlfriend named Roz, who he's been together with, I think, about 8 years. And as a result, of his procrastination on this anthology and his kind of just general kind of like lounge about sort of poetry, sitting by the river kind of lifestyle has finally left him. So he's living by himself, running out of money, unable to write this anthology, and taking joy at looking at inchworms in his barn where he does his writing, of walking his dog Smacko, who may be the best named dog
That's a
I have
great, yeah,
ever
great name.
encountered.
Yeah.
I was immediately like we actually just lost our dog in February, not to bring
Oh, I'm
everything
sorry.
down. And I was
Yeah.
like, it's okay. I mean, he was over 18 years old. He was a lovely, lovely dog. His name was Lono. And I was like, oh my God, we should have named him Smacko. Like I would much rather have said Smacko for the 18 years of his lovely life. Um, I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, so like, what are the sort of narrative where's the suspense, where's the conflict, as I usually end up talking about when I'm talking about fiction and writing fiction with students. You need something to go wrong in a narrative to propel it forward. The things that are going wrong in this book and that propel us forward are the not writing of the anthology, and will he actually finish it, and will he get Roz back? And I don't know, maybe we don't want to spoil it, but that's
Yeah.
it. Like that's the whole thing that you're like waiting for. And then
Yeah.
most of the book is his musings on poetry, and you're right, it's digressive and yeah, kind of winsome and folksy at times as
Yeah.
well.
And that I've not read any of his other books apart from these two, but my understanding is that this aspect of it is not atypical. That he has a whole book that's just a guy going up a going up a an escalator, and another book that's just a guy feeding his daughter with a bottle, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah,
I've also, I mean, I was drawn to this because of the poetry element. I've known
right,
about the book
right,
for years, um, and I have myself a kind of like more than passing interest in novels that are about poets or
right.
strongly include elements of poetry. I wrote parts of my dissertation on this as it relates to Emily Dickinson. And there's a fair number of novels about Dickinson. So I came, and like also Walt Whitman, like Michael Cunningham's Specimen Days is like a series of novellas that feature Whitman in different um, capacities and are different genres. Like I think one's like a police procedural, one's kind of like sci-fi set in the future. And he borrows his title from Whitman's, long prose narrative. So the poetry was what drew me into the novel.
Yeah.
Um, and then that kind of like weird subgenre of novels themselves. So yeah, I've not read any of Baker's other work. I'm kind of keen to do so now though, because I this kind of like novel is one that I'm kind of fond of. I like a novel that gets inside the interior life of a human being. It's almost inevitably first person, though not exclusively, and sort of works through the strangeness and the unusualness of that kind of mental landscape. There was another book that I mentioned in our correspondence that does this. It's actually third person limited, but it does it really well, nevertheless. And it's a relatively new novel called Practice by Rosalind Brown. This is a very
Hmm.
young British novelist, and it's about a young woman, an undergraduate, who is writing a paper about Shakespeare's sonnets. And it's told in these little passages and the novel never leaves the campus and only very briefly leaves her dormitory as she works her way through it. And I found it captivating, but I don't know, maybe I'm just weird
Okay.
like that. I love those sort of novels.
Yeah, and well, and they're tough to do, and I think it's partly like part of what he lights upon here. And I was going to say the other what's the other book I can think of that I really did enjoy as a novel about poetry was the Sam Riviere when we talked to him ages ago. I can't remember the name of that book. Oh,
I don't know.
Dead Souls. It's named after the Gogol book. Yeah, and
Oh, okay. I don't know it at all.
it's like a weird sci-fi poetry book, but partly it's not. If I recall it, what it doesn't try to do is stir our imaginative sympathy for the solitary brilliance of the poet himself, which like my recollection is as like a teenager is going to see the Belle of Amherst, the celebrated one woman show about Emily Dickinson that is just stultifying, just brutal, just punishing.
I again, like I said, I wrote a dissertation partially on Dickinson, and I was doing reception studies, and I managed to avoid that one, knowing that it wasn't particularly great. And I'm
Yeah.
about to teach a Dickinson seminar in the fall, and just in a couple of weeks. And I don't do that, but now I'm interested, or at least I hope my students get interested in A Quiet Passion, the new Dickinson biopic, which is
Oh
not
yeah, yeah,
bad.
yeah. Okay, all right.
Yeah, but yeah, I remember. Yeah, I've seen clips from Bill of Amherst. It
The
looks
best rendering of that is the brief appearance it makes in Being John Malkovich when he produces a like a colossal puppet and does a 1 inch enormous puppet show of the
right.
Bell of
I
Amherst.
for, yes, yes, yes. That's a really great. I'd forgotten about that scene.
But yeah,
There's a
but
whole
like
series of yeah.
yeah, part of what is I think effective about this poet narrator is that he's not a good poet. Like it's not about a solitary genius producing solitary genius work because that itself like the work is the thing there. It's like it's not like any of us can really give an account of that finally. Like, well, where does the genius come from? It's but a bad poet makes for a kind of a fascinating. Also, I thought like surprisingly good was the it was like the second sequel to the A Quiet Place, like a little like niche horror movie, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's like a little tiny a sequel of a sequel starring Lupita Nyong'o as a bad
Uh-huh.
poet in New York City as like aliens
Oh,
attack, and
really?
it's like strangely great. It's like a really tiny weird little, and she's like miserable and she's dying of cancer, and you get like there's just enough of her poetry and her life as a poet comes in that it's like she I think it starts with her reading a bad poem, and it's like the movie doesn't try to pretend she's a genius, but you just sort of like see her like miserable. And then
You
aliens
know,
attack, and she's like, "Well, my life is strangely slightly better when the aliens attack."
I this is great. I mean, this is like slightly afield, but and I know you've talked about movies and poetry in other podcasts. I can't remember who it was with, but you talked about the Maggie Gyllenhaal film about the kindergarten
Oh, a
teacher
teacher. Yeah,
who,
yeah, yeah.
yes, who
The
encounters
kindergarten
like a
teacher, because the teacher's the also good, very weird other movie. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, so there's a wonderful scholar who died a few years ago and was a friend and teacher of mine, Lawrence Goldstein, who's got a great book called The American Poet at the Movies. And it predates all of the
Yeah,
examples
yeah, yeah.
that we've given, but he's a poet and a critic who grew up in Los Angeles, so his connection to the movies is native. And in that book, he talks about how poets have talked about the movies, from Hart Crane to Vachel Lindsay, who shows up in The Anthologist, et cetera, et cetera. But then he even created a list online of like poets showing up in movies, which they do from time to time. And like one of my favorites is the Jim Jarmusch movie Patterson with Adam Driver as a
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
William Carlos Williams inspired, well, in location only, but he's a bus driver who writes these poems. And anyway, yeah,
Yeah, that's because yeah, that was one I came back to a couple years ago, and it is I think in a way like it illuminates looking at that illuminates this book a little bit too because it is that one I would say is most charming just taken as it like it's least it's worst when you try to read it as being really about poetry. That I think
yeah,
like he like Adam Driver's so winning, and the woman who plays his like ridiculous but wonderful wife is so winning,
yes,
and even like the I
yes.
forget the little the character actor who does the like incel guy who freaks out of the bar, or not incel, but he's like a broken-hearted guy who freaks out of the bar with a gun. Like, so great little cast, and like
Yeah,
Jim Jarmusch is wonderful. In a
yeah,
way,
yeah.
like it could be just as good if it were a movie about like a painter or printmaker. Like, if it's, this one, and I think like David Orr made a comment about the anthologist that like,
Yeah, that review is pretty good. I like the
yeah,
David
yeah,
Orr take
yeah,
on this book.
like
Yeah.
it's as a manifesto about poetry, it gets into some trouble, but like as an evocation of what it feels like to be in the poetry world, it's pretty good. It's like it's not just that he's winning; it's that there were a lot of moments listening to it where I thought, like, yeah, 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 that thing, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it somehow gets at a feeling of being a writer and being a poet and being, like so many of us are, lost in the composition and stuck for months or years on end and feeling out of step with the world. Like I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that's one of the things that this narrator certainly is, kind of to a greater degree than many of us, hopefully in our normal lives as poets and human beings making our way in a capitalist society. But it gets at that feeling really well. And yeah, Orr is right that like there are many missteps within his weird defenses and cul-de-sacs of thinking about poetry. But the act of being really interested in poetry means that you get into those weird cul-de-sacs and you get into those weird conversations. And
Yeah.
even if Paul Chowder's explanation of meter is so far off that it had me just like frothing at the mouth, as I think I wrote to you in my correspondence, I was just so pissed with it. And I'm not really like the formalist poet, or perhaps not as much. Um, Nevertheless, like
You
I liked the feeling of being in the book, right?
yeah. I was looking at some of your poems though. You do, I mean, you write some formal poems and you write a lot of poems that are in that incorporate internal rhyme. You also do I mean,
Yes.
and I didn't like scan them carefully, but you do have a fair number of curdinal poems, or what Cameron would call curdinal poems, where
I don't know that term,
they're
cardinal?
they're metrical poems that have been rebroken so as to be disguised, and you often rebreak them kind of
Yes.
radically, so they have like if you
Yes.
look at them, they have the appearance of like they're scattered across the page, and they're lots of spaces, and they look almost like an avant-garde poem. But then if
Yeah.
it would be possible to rebreak them into fairly regular lines in many cases.
That's very spot on. Yeah. And I didn't even realize that. I mean, I know that I'm doing it now, but I remember years ago talking with the poet Jason Koo and like a very early poetry interview I was doing, really like just out of MFA. And he was like, "Oh yeah, like that's an iambic line that you have there." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I guess it is." Like I just kind of was defaulting to it. But that's totally true. I both am interested in internal and even like some, moving it across the page, masking it in some way, scattering it in some way, and rhyme as well. And then, I do certainly end up, in some metrical lines.
Yeah.
And I had training in this stuff too,
Right.
which is one of the things that I wonder about like Baker and his background with poetry. He's clearly a lover of it, and that comes through in the Paul Chowder character. Like he's one almost has to just presume that when Chowder starts to opine about poetry, it's Baker talking, more or less. I mean, I'd be curious if you think
Yeah.
otherwise, and I'm open to hearing other claims about it. But that was at least my sort of take on it, is that this is his way of, in the mode and genre he knows best, writing a novel, writing a first person narrative where not a whole lot happens. He gets to finally talk about this art form that is clearly moving to him. I can't remember where I was going with this. Yeah. Anyway, nevertheless,
And
like
I was curious
yeah.
because you said you studied with
Oh
David
yeah.
Baker, and who else was it? Who was the other person you said you studied meter with?
I was just looking him up before this podcast. Paul Kaparsky,
Okay.
who is like an internationally renowned linguist. And when I was a graduate student at Stanford doing my PhD, he taught a course called Metrics. And it had a mix of linguists and comp lit students and English literature graduate students in it.
Yeah.
And it was really great. Like I learned a ton. I really didn't always agree with Paul. Like I would try to do some kind of stranger papers or projects that would try to, for instance, I was really kind of invested in Whitman then. That was what I was working on for my dissertation, at least in part. And I would try to do like some sort of metrical readings of some of Whitman to sort of see if there's some kind of underlying shapeliness or sort of something going on in the background. And he's much more like, this is a system, we can study this.
Right.
And David Baker was my undergraduate mentor and has a book called Meter in English, which is a collection of, I think, 10 or 12 essays responding to a particular person's series of 10 or 12 points about meter. And I teach it with my undergraduates, and I still think like I'm a pretty decent prosodist. And when I was reading Baker on prosody, I was like, oh, this is somebody who has a love of the art form, is trained, at least in part, according to his bio, as a musician, having gone to the Eastman School of Music, at least for some amount of his undergraduate, but doesn't really quite get how meter works. He's kind of coming at it from above and trying to impose a system on it. And this is one of the things that I talk to my students about, that like, if you're going to kind of get this, you kind of have to begin from the language and move up. as opposed to begin from a system and move down.
And it's, I mean, the musical link is explicit in the book. He sets out on the
Yes.
page, he sets out
Yes.
staffs of music that he writes for the poems. And then
Yeah.
in the audiobook, he sings them aloud. And so it is,
Yeah.
and even his language for, he kind of talks about the peons as 16th notes, which honestly is like probably a more digestible way to talk about them initially than like a tertius peon, like it's,
I
yeah.
mean, in a way, it does feel when he starts to talk about meter, and again, David Orr gets at this nicely in his review, it feels less, he uses the word dreadful, right? Like there's nothing that kills a conversation about poetry faster than, well, let's sit down and like put little
Yeah.
marks, diacritical marks on top of the line. You are suddenly in high school, you're shackled to your desk, you're reading Robert Frost or Shakespeare, and you're feeling so out of your comfort zone and unhappy, and you just are waiting for like lunch period to go make eyes at the girl across the cafeteria. And Baker's narrator Paul Chowder has a wonderful way of not doing that. It feels folksy and inviting, and he always has these like little asides where he's like, well, wait, that's actually not quite right at all, or I'm
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
leading you astray, and now let me reassert it. And the language of all that is wonderful. The problem is he's so wrong. Like that's the part that is like drives me mad. It's like he kind of like makes this case that all of English is like a 4-beat line. He
Yeah,
wants to
yeah.
sort of make the case that like the rests between lines are a beat. He cherry picks examples from the metrical history of Anglophone poetry. He misidentifies ballad meter and misdescribes that. There's a moment where he is transcribing, I think it was in some of the pages that I scanned for you, where he's transcribing a John Dryden poem.
Yeah.
And he leaves out some of the punctuation and then makes this case about like enjambment. And this is not how we should listen to it
Yeah,
because
yeah.
Dryden didn't want enjambment. And it's like, well, there's a comma at the end of that first line. So it's not an enjambment, dude.
Yeah,
Anyway, yeah.
no. I mean, yeah. This like it's funny because listening to it again, a week or so ago, and then rereading these passages you sent me just because so I could see the visual notation he uses, which is very unusual. It makes us like it makes a certain kind of sense that basically what he does is every stressed syllable he marks with a large circle with a number in it, numbered for
Yeah.
the which accent in the line it is. And then sometimes he will elaborate that by having smaller numbers in between the way you would do it in music. So it's 1 2 3 4 2 2 3 4 3 2 3 4 4 for those are for peons for or for 16th notes as it would have them. And then like visually it's clear enough. He has like rereading it, my thought was like I had like three sort of like a threefold response to his treatment of meter. One was like, well, yes, like thank you, and very obviously, so much of the charm and pleasure in poetry comes from rhyme and meter, and like just
Sure.
addressing this frankly and
Yeah.
unself-consciously and like in a charming, inviting way in 2009 felt like like okay, all
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
thank you for actually bothering to say this. And that
Yeah.
so in
He
like
has a lovely
yeah,
moment. Yeah.
and
Oh, sorry. He
yeah,
has a
yeah, yeah,
lovely
please,
moment where
please.
he's like reading, yeah, where he's like talking about reading a New Yorker, and he starts reading the lines, and he's like, and there will always be that time when I suddenly realize that it's not rhyming, and then his spirits drop.
Yeah,
Which is
yeah,
sort of like an
like
honest sort of moment.
right. That like that's part of the experience of reading. It's also like so much of what one actually bothers to remember, and like for not coincidentally is metrical and rhyming. Then like there are sort of I guess like I have like three other. There's the sort of like the interesting tension between who he is as a poet and what his like opinions about poetry are, which again I think like one of the reviews I saw said this was a failure of his characterization. I think he's very wrong there. Like, in fact, like the denial and self-loathing of the character and like the sense that like, oh God, what I'm doing is not actually the right thing to be doing. To me, that felt like very native and true to his identity as a poet. Although there are definitely parts, particularly in the last third of the book, where it feels like he outstrips the character to really dig into his idiosyncratic theories about meter. And we sort of like, those are the places where I
Yeah.
feel like, okay, we've really left the fun tension of Paul Chowder behind. And it's still folksy and it's still inviting and it's still charmingly told. but like
Yeah.
you're sort of really bearing down to make Nicholson Baker's point about the way meter really works. Those are the places that felt to me most, they went most astray character wise, and they also went most astray when it comes to meter. Otherwise, though, I thought like there was this kind of charming middle ground where it wasn't just that he was bringing up the existence and some of the qualities of meter and rhyme in a charming way. And it wasn't that he was like making his own weird thesis statement, but that he was showing us a few new angles on meter, which is like good criticism, good philosophy for me. Like
Yeah.
what I really want from it is like give me a new angle on this thing. It's not that I need to agree with you, but like show me another way
Yeah.
to talk about it. And I think like the two things that I really value as observations about meter in this book are the importance of the rest. Although he like as soon as he starts to try to get formal in identifying how the rest works, it gets like okay, all right, you're like. Well,
Just stop.
but if pentameter line is actually a hexameter line, but a 3-beat line is really a 4-beat line, except because it has a rest. But then a 4-beat line is still a 4-beat line. But like, it doesn't, you know, like when he tries to make it a system, it doesn't really work. But as a
None of
sort
it
of an
adds up. None of
observation,
it
that like,
adds up.
hey, a rest is a
Right.
really important part of so much of poet. Not essentially. He's like very
Yeah.
anti-enjambment, even light enjambment, which starts to get again like anytime he comes up with a rule or a system, he gets into trouble. But then the other thing that I thought made a lot of sense was that there's a they're kind of there are three orders of significance in our reception of a meter. One is the length overall, like the number of total beats in the line. The
Okay.
second is the number of syllables in a foot, right? He doesn't call them feet
Yeah.
exactly. But then the
Yeah.
third is the order of those syllables stressed, right? Like, so his point is that it's actually more like it would be possible the way we use like the way our notation works, we start with the name of the foot, iambic pentameter.
Right.
And
Right.
we
The
name the
dominant
foot
foot
after right,
begins.
the dominant type of foot. But his point is that like a truer way to name the line would probably start go the other way around. It would start with the length of the foot. I mean, forget how you say it, but like what we most notice is the length of the line, then the length of the foot, and then the order. Because he brings up a few lines. I thought like he does a pretty good job of quoting some the Edna St. Vincent Millay poem. Love has gone and left me, and I don't know what to do. This or that or what you will is all the same to me. But all the things that I begin, I leave before I'm through. There's little use in anything as far as I can see.
Yeah. This is
If you
Ashes of Life by
yeah,
Edna
if you
St.
stick a
Vincent
stock
Millay.
of liquor, and this is the he quotes the Norm Newman Levy. If you stick a stock of liquor in your locker, it is slick to stick a lock upon your stock. Where some joker who is slicker is going to trick you of your liquor, though you snicker, you'll feel sicker from the shock. That part of his point is that these are quadruplets. There's sort of one beat for every four syllables, but I think he also identifies that like even if the placement of that beat shifts slightly within those four syllables, that it's still happening once for every four syllables is part of what we're hearing over the course of the line. And that ends up being more important than like the precise order of the stresses in the in that pattern of four syllables. And I think like Susan Spears made a similar point that like in English we get because we're trying to come up with a way to describe English verse that we're borrowing from antique verse, we get
Hmm.
fussy about
Yeah.
the species of foot in a way that
Right. Right.
matters, but actually maybe matters in a slightly less salient way than the way we tend to articulate it. So like that I appreciated, although
Yeah.
like his idea, like when he starts to become a purist about what is the true English line, that feels like, well, no, you're starting to miss like the real beauty of English, which is that it's hybridized and it's shifting and it's not so consistently this pounding 4-beat line. It plays a little bit. It's not the same. Doesn't have exactly the same pressure at every point.
Right. Right.
But yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I have so
jump
many
in.
thoughts about that. Yeah. No, that's interesting. Like I wonder where these are. And so I'm trying to process what you say, think about it in relationship to Baker. And then, so, take this all as a rough draft. I wonder whether it is that the foot is the thing that we notice second or after we notice length of line. If the poem's recited orally, I wonder if we don't hear the foot first, or like the dominant foot seems to be the thing that we sort of notice earliest. It's also the case that like the foot, if we're actually thinking about the corpus of formal poetry in the Anglophone world, the foot is almost always an IN. Like, I mean, obviously there's
Yeah,
anapestic
yeah,
meters, there's
yeah.
trochaic meters, but I don't know what the
Yeah,
percentages
yeah.
are,
Or
but
it's
it's
all
got to be north of
alternating. Yeah.
75%.
I mean, though he also like the other point he
Right.
makes that I think it rings very true is that you if you know a trochaic line becomes an iambic line if you just put an and at the front of it, and so the like
Right. Exactly.
the silent rests or breaths or dropped feet or dropped syllables even will will sort of would technically shift the name of the game, and this is like feet don't correspond to syntactical breaks, they don't correspond to word breaks, and so I mean, yeah, my inclination to say that in English, because we don't have regular syllable length like you do in classical Latin and Greek, which allows you to have quantitative meter. We have
Right.
accents
Right.
and we have stresses, and those stresses vary slightly.
Right. Right.
My thought would be like the first thing we hear is really the rhyme, and then we kind of work backward from
Probably.
there.
Yeah.
Which is partly why like when you're talking about rhyme, when you're talking about meter and rhyme with people who are not very familiar with poetry, you mentioned that you had a lady at a reading say like, oh, thank you for bringing rhyme back to poetry. That's what people hear first. They are also
Yeah.
hearing meter, but they're not
Right.
consciously processing it the same way. The rhyme sort of sets off the lines, and it also sets off the stanzas, if we're at least traditionally speaking. Um, yeah, I mean
I think that's
that's my
right.
my instinct. I mean, because it's all the observation is that like if you work in shorter lines, when I've written in trimeter or tetrameter,
You're going to get those rhymes more quickly.
well, you get the rhymes more quickly, unless you're doing 14ers, like the
Right.
ABXB, as is very common,
Which
or
is what the Enna St. Vincent Millay poem that you quoted is in. And a lot of
yeah,
his examples are 14ers.
yeah, no, no, exactly. And you also though, at least my experience is that when you have a short line, when sort of you're containing a certain number of accents or a certain number of stresses within a pretty short space, the precise order in which they come becomes a little bit less meaningful. That it's a little bit more like rap prosody, which is like there will
Mm.
be four beats in a line. They can come anywhere, and if you're fast enough, you can cram in a lot of syllables in between them.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there will be
Yeah,
four
yeah.
beats, and they will come eventually. And so, like, I think that there's a that I obviously like an accentual syllabic creature. I live in iambs mostly, except when I'm
Yeah, yeah.
currently torturing myself with sapphics. But yeah, I think that the like he points out that just describing the raven as trochaic octameter is really
Right.
not capturing an essential quality of it. So
That makes total sense.
again,
I
it
buy
just felt
that
like
bit.
there was like a useful angle he took on this, but as soon as he started to come up with his own doctrines, then he really went off went off the edge.
I think all that's right. Yeah, and we could get into like our own little sort of like side kind of debate in terms of what do we hear first when we hear a line of poetry? What do we hear second? Is it the rhyme? Is it the meter? I think I might be more on the side of I hear the meter first, but it depends on the regularity of the meter. It depends on how
Right.
many
Yeah. Yeah.
substitutions are in the line. A trochaic line obviously is just missing the and at the beginning of the line, but it also sort of, particularly if it has rhyme at the end and it's a catalectic trochee, which most of them are, so you don't have
Right.
you don't have the extra syllable at the end. You're starting each line with that hard beat. So like if I think
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the witches,
Double toil and trouble, fire burning cauldron
there you
double. Yeah. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's where I hear that trochee very, very
And
quickly.
they're
I mean, I
ending with
guess
feminine
yeah,
rhyme in that case, which sort of seals
right.
it off.
That's a good
Yeah.
point.
But yeah,
Right.
when it's
Yeah.
that the I think of it as the lullaby line, the headless four beat line, which could also be a tailless four beat line depending on whether it's
Right.
iambic or trochaic,
Yeah.
but it becomes sort of
Yeah.
academic. Like the point is that it's an alternating meter and it has this number
Yeah.
of beats per line.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right that like when he gets into the more prescriptive or more kind of like grander theories or however we want to describe, how far he will go with his claims, that is certainly where he gets into trouble. I still struggle though with like that line where you quote, "If you stick a stock of liquor in your locker," in part because, at least in the way that I learned how to scan from Paul Kaparsky, among others,
Yeah, yeah.
you can't let three syllables go unstressed next to each other. And this is at least what I teach my students,
Yeah,
whether
yeah.
I'm right or wrong. Whenever you've got, three syllables in a row that you are marking as either unstressed or stressed, something has got to get promoted. So if they're all
Yeah, yeah,
unstressed,
yeah.
something ends up getting promoted, or something gets demoted if they're, a sort of strange combination of three, seemingly very strong beaded.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah, and that's the part where I sort of feel like he's imposing something down from above. That like he's bringing a kind of musical, 1 2 3 4 2 2 3 4 3 2 3 4, and that's the thing that I kind of struggle with, because it contributes to the extent that this even matters, because how many people really care, but it contributes to the um, miseducation of readers about poetry and meter. That it feels again like a system brought down from above, as opposed to a set of accents that derive from the language coming up. Like the way I talk, at least talk to my students about doing meter, is the first thing you want to do in a line is look for the multisyllabic words, because
Yeah,
you know
yeah,
how to
yeah, yeah,
pronounce
yeah.
those. If you're particularly if you're a native speaker of English, you know how to pronounce them. If you aren't, go to the dictionary, or ask. There's words that we don't know, even if you're a native speaker, and that's where you begin your kind of scansion. And then what becomes tricky is the monosyllabic words, of which we have quite a few in English, from articles to prepositions, and figuring out where to stress between those. That's at least the way I begin it, so that it feels like it's coming organically out of the language, as opposed to, in this case, Chowder's musical system coming down from above, as winsome and sort of charming as it feels as he talks about it. I'm still
Yeah.
sort of like, I feel kind of like a pedant as I talk about
No,
this
no, no,
too.
no.
Like there's a version of me that, like, yeah,
But this is again, this is why I tend so much to love description and alternative vantages more than I love systems and doctrines, because I think like they're what you're I absolutely do the same thing when I talk about meter, and like if you're first trying to get your bearings and just like being able to hear meter at all, there's nothing like a two-syllable word, especially two. I mean, two is like even more so than three or four often, because you end up having a
yeah,
really strong contrast between those two syllables, and that can really help you.
exactly.
It's also true if you're writing a line of iambic pentameter that like writing 10 monosyllables in a row, it can be real hard to nail down the meter, and throwing in a few
Exactly.
polysyllabic words in there can really lock it into place. So like
Yep.
that's totally true, and I absolutely tend to work in the same way. And my rule of thumb tends to be like, yes, there are differences in meter, just like there are differences in the height of different people standing in a line, but you could still order the line such that you have short, tall, short, tall, short, tall, short, tall, even though some of the talls are actually shorter than some of the shorts if you were to put them in an
Right.
absolute scale. So like, yeah, that totally
Yeah.
makes sense to me. On the other hand, if you were to like drape a large sheet over that line, what might happen
These
is
are
you'd
great
have
metaphors,
like
by the way.
right, you'd have like a couple of those heads that would really stand up above the others. And it seems like that's sort of where
Yeah.
he's coming from, is like you have a few peaks that leap out, and then the problem is that he
Yes.
then draws a rule from that, which is those are the true
Agreed.
stresses, and the others don't
Yes.
count. And I think like probably
Right.
the Fitzgeraldians would say, aha, and that's why there are really 4 or 5 levels of stress per.
Yep.
That's when I think like my response is like, I think you're probably right, but I also think like diagnosing those
It's complicated enough.
consistently, right, diagnosing those consistently across line after line after line sounds like A, like no fun, B, like probably hard to do accurately, and C, like what are we doing anymore? Are we writing poetry and reading it, or are we like annotating lines?
Right. It starts to be an exercise in phonetics or linguistics. I totally agree. And I think that's probably, yeah. Um, and I have, I will occasionally with some of my students say, like, there is, not all stresses are created equal. And this is why some people have, you mentioned Fitzgerald. I'm not sure who
I,
you're
I,
referring
I
to,
want
but
I
I
don't
know,
remember. I want to say it's this Fitzgerald's system of stress. Where like there are people who say like actually the true way
oh, the
to
4B.
annotate a line is 4 levels of stress
Yes.
per, yeah.
Right.
Which
And
just
that is
to
what I
me
have, like,
sounds like
basically, yeah.
miserable to
Oh, it's
figure
crazy.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is totally weird, because we have this binary system that doesn't quite fit the language, doesn't fit every line of poetry as smoothly. I love your metaphor of like people standing in a line and you put, a sheet over all of them. And absolutely right. There's like sometimes it feels like we ought to just do 1 2 3 4, but as you know, like that would be even crazier. There's one example where it works really, really nicely, in Astrophil and Stella. Sydney's Astrophil and Stella. And I think he was thinking about this because there was all sorts of playfulness at this sort of early stage of English language poetry where, people were experimenting with quantitatives, iambic pentameter maybe didn't feel quite as, what's the word, sort of foundational and
Yeah, yeah,
canonical
yeah,
yet.
yeah.
And what's the line? I think it's with how sad steps, O moon, thou climbst the skies. And those first four syllables, and this isn't an argument original to me, but I can't remember where I read it. Um, those first four syllables really nicely indicate how you can have four levels of stress, and that Sydney is actually using them to match what's happening in the poem. So, with how sad steps,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
one, two, three, four. The strongest beat is
Increase in strength as you go.
exactly. And it looks, or it feels a little bit as you increase, that the stresses are increasing as uh, the moon is going up into the sky. I love that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that's one line out of millions.
Yeah, yeah.
So absolutely right. Well, I don't think we should be trying to do four all the time. In fact, I know that there's like a system, again, this is like goes way back to like this linguistics course I took, where somebody tried to do like 15 or 16 different like notations for levels of stress, which
Right,
sounds even
right.
more,
Just yeah.
mind-numbingly insane.
No, yeah. I mean, I mean, he says he kind of inverts the we, in English have two major registers. We have plenty of registers, but we have two major registers, rooted in the Anglo-Saxon and the Latin origins
Yeah.
that we tend to think that the polite words for things are the Latinate words, and the impolite words are the for the same things are the Anglo-Saxon words.
Like fuck.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Fuck and fornicate, shit and feces, and so on.
Right.
Cunt and vagina. Although vagina honestly
Yep.
is like a very offensive word because my recollection is that it means
Yes.
sheath, right? Like
It means
it's
sheath with a
like
sword. Absolutely.
right, yeah.
Yes.
It's
All
just like
right.
that's more
Latin
misogynistic
for the
than
win.
cunt, but yeah.
It is. Yes. Yes.
But yeah, like his argument is of course that like it's the the French Latin via French influence that's the decadent corrupting force, and that the true English beat is that for which is like this
Right.
is silly. Like part of the greatness of English is that you get both of those, and like where he like both identifies something basically true and really goes astray is when he talks about how in most pentameter lines there are really three notable stresses, but he starts to turn this
Yeah.
into a rule. And he gives a bunch of examples in a row
Yes.
in which it's not
Yes.
just that there are how small of all that human hearts endure, the part which wars or kings can cause or cure, all human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons monarchs must obey. At that time of year thou mayst me behold, when yellow leaves are none to view to hang. So his point seems to be not only that there are only three true beats in a pentameter line, but also that the beats happen in that it's the first foot, the third foot, and the fifth foot. Of course, like if you
Yeah.
look at some of the other lines from those same poems that he's quoting, you find that it's not that even if there are generally speaking three stronger stresses in a pentameter line, they don't tend to fall precisely in that. And that's the most common order for them to fall, first, third, and fifth. But it's not consistently. And in fact, the play back and forth against the ordering is part of what
Is
makes
what makes it
pentameter lines pleasing in the ear and fun, like, and exactly the kind of modulation within regularity that you're describing in the Sydney poem. It's like
yeah.
that's the magic of it. Like that's what's wonderful. The same way
Absolutely.
that we use Anglo-Saxon and Latinate words together,
Right.
and it's more
Right.
fun than if you were just purely sticking to one or the other.
It's what you're describing absolutely is like a kind of form of hybrid vigor in the
Yeah,
language.
yeah, yeah.
Right, to get back to dogs, like I get the impression Smacko is a mutt, and perhaps Paul Chowder would agree that hybrid vigor is valuable, though I don't think, at least in metrics, he would. I mean, it works both in terms of how English formed with a combination of French or Anglo, or excuse me, Norman French probably, and Anglo-Saxon coming together after 1066. So we have an interest in both accents and the number of syllables. The French measure syllables, right? Beowulf measures accents. A
Yeah,
sort of reductive way to think about this
yeah,
is
yeah,
that those
yeah.
come together and we get Anglo-Saxon. And then also in terms of how a line of, say, iambic pentameter tends to be interesting, it would be really dull and frankly kind of soporific if it were always da-dun, 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 da-dun. We have substitutions.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah.
you know, there's three that are really common. There's the first foot trochee, there's like the leaving off the feminine or hypermetrical ending at the end, and then midline trochee. I mean, at least this is how I've learned it. Like those are
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
three
yeah.
most common substitutions. There's plenty of others, and sticking those in as you're writing a line, and you know, when you become a sort of formal poet with some felicity with meter, that isn't doesn't even feel like sticking it in, right? It's
No,
part
no,
of your
no.
sort of playfulness, right? When you read Frost, you don't
Right.
get the impression like, oh, here's the time for a metrical substitution, folks. It's part of his, you know, it's like built almost into his DNA or his tongue, as it were.
It's part of the when you have an ear for a kind of line, that becomes part of the ear for it. And pentameter, iambic pentameter in English is particularly, it has the nice quality of being both consistent and flexible. And it's not
Yes,
just like there you know, Elijah's pointed out there's both variation, which is what you're describing, where you have like a handful of standard acceptable you know, very variant foots within the pentameter
right,
structure, but there's also modulation, which is exactly the thing that Baker seems sort of to miss, which is that no,
right,
that some iambs are a stronger contrast than others, that some of them are closer to Pyrrhic, that some of them are closer to Spondy, that
right.
you know that you have different you know levels of accent or different levels of stress rather within the same line, that like that's part of what makes it pleasing, even if you, and that's, you know, as I think Shane's pointed out, like in a lot of traditional English verse you have less like you don't necessarily have as many variations as you would in more modern iambic pentameter, but
Mm,
there's tons of modulation. So that even if
mm,
technically speaking, you could argue that this whole poem is all iamb, so that's pretty rare. Even there,
right.
in a good poem, there's going to be a lot of variance within the level of intensity of those iambs.
Yeah, I think all that's right, and I think that it's one of the reasons one could make the claim that iambic pentameter, or just you know the iamb in general, or anyway, how we've started to sort of create metrical poetry is so lasting in English. I mean, you
Yeah.
know, all the things aside, of course, you know, Chowder goes into this in terms of like Walt Whitman's sort of effect on the language and the you know, rise of free verse, and he talks about the modernists, etc. And that's all still true. Um, but like the sonnet, right? Because the sonnet is so flexible within its
Yeah.
14 lines, because iambic pentameter is so flexible within its you know 5 beats and how you modulate or vary or substitute, it probably contributes to its longevity.
That was the first half of my conversation with Derek. If you would like to hear the rest, you can go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com, put your email address in, and I'll give you a week's access for free. After that, it's pretty fucking cheap. If you would really like to listen to The Secret Show, which has a new episode every week, 150 odd, almost 160 now. If you would like to listen to The Secret Show, but you really can't afford it, send me a note at sleerickets@gmail.com and I will hook you up. And if you have some expendable income and you would like to support the show and its listeners, then go to sleerickets.substack.com and sign up to be, I have a dirty name that I gave the founding members is what it's called. But if you'd like to be a founding member, it is a little more money every month, but it makes a big difference. And send me a note. I've got your, you know, you have my ear. you have my ear. My email address, as always, is sleerickets@gmail.com. So let me know about your complaints or your praise or your questions. You can also, if you sign up to join The Secret Show, you can submit a poem for the listener crit episodes. Not just a poem. I mean, how about let's do one at a time, you know, but you can submit poems for the listener crit episodes, and I will, along with either Cameron or Alice, or maybe somebody else. I don't know. We've only done Cameron and Alice so far. We'll see how it goes. But I recorded one with Cameron just tonight. We will give a frank and thorough reading of your poem on the podcast, and anonymous. Frank, thorough, and anonymous. So you can check all that out again at sleerickets.substack.com. Thank you all for listening. Go buy Derek's book, When the Earth Flies into the Sun, for some rich spicy cardinal poems, as we discussed. I can't remember if it was the first or the second half, but go check that out today. Thank you all for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.